This is the story of the king, whose wife's blood carried a royal curse. Who was he, and from where did the blood originate? Madrid, May 31st, 1906. 2:47 in the afternoon. The city was dressed in flowers. Balconies along Calle Mayor had been strung with white bunting and carnations so red they looked like open wounds against the pale stone buildings. Thousands of people lined the streets, vendors selling roasted chestnuts, children perched on their fathers' shoulders, old women in black mantillas pressing rosaries between their fingers and muttering prayers that the young king would be happy. For once, just once, let something in Spain be uncomplicated and good and full of joy. King Alfonso XIII was 20 years old, and he was in love. He stood in the courtyard of the royal palace and watched Victoria Eugenie of Battenberg step from the gilded carriage, and whatever composure a king is trained to maintain dissolved quietly in him. She was luminous. That was the only word. Her white satin gown caught the May light and scattered it, and her face beneath the veil was calm and serious and impossibly young. And Alfonso, who had been raised to believe that royal marriage was a political arrangement dressed in sentiment, felt something shift in his chest that had nothing to do with politics. He had chosen her himself. That was the remarkable thing. In an age when royal marriages were brokered by intermediaries and approved by committees and debated in foreign ministries, Alfonso XIII had looked at a photograph of Victoria Eugenie, Anna as her family called her, and made a decision that was, at its core, a young man's decision. She was beautiful, she was kind, she was granddaughter to the most famous queen who had ever lived, and she had something in her eyes in that photograph, some quality of steadiness, of quiet intelligence, that Alfonso recognized as the thing he had been missing in his own loud, precarious, lonely life. He had asked, she had agreed, she had converted to Catholicism for him, leaving behind the faith of her childhood, the faith of her grandmother's long English winters, and crossed into his world without complaint. The Spanish court had not entirely welcomed her. She was foreign, she was Protestant turned Catholic, she spoke Spanish with an accent that made dowagers wince. But Alfonso had not cared. He had chosen her, and what a king chose, a king protected. The crowd roared as she approached, and Alfonso smiled, and in that moment, with the May sun falling over Madrid and the flowers rioting from every window and the whole joyful machinery of celebration turning around them, it was entirely possible to believe that this was the beginning of something beautiful and long. 40 minutes later, an anarchist named Mateo Moral threw a bomb hidden inside a bouquet of flowers from a balcony on Calle Mayor, and 23 people died in the street below. The horses were killed, the carriages were destroyed, the air turned to smoke and screaming and the smell of blood in the afternoon heat. When the dust cleared, Ina's wedding dress was soaked red, not her own blood, but the blood of those around her, splattered across the white satin that had been catching sunlight just minutes before. Alfonso and Anna stood in the wreckage, unhurt. He took her hand, he held it. In the chaos and the noise and the horror, with bodies being carried from the street and soldiers running and the crowd no longer roaring but sobbing, he looked at her and she looked at him, and neither of them spoke, because some moments are too large for words. They had survived. They were alive and young and together, and Spain was still theirs. And the terrible morning had not killed them. And Alfonso looked at his bride, his chosen, his Ina, his wife of 40 minutes, and believed, with everything in him, that surviving this meant they would survive everything. He was right about the bomb. He could not have known about the gene. It had been traveling toward him for a very long time. Queen Victoria had been born in 1819, and at some point in the long history of DNA, replicating itself across generations, A single letter in her genetic code had been copied incorrectly. Not a word, not a sentence, not a chapter. A single letter in a text, 3 billion letters long. One misprint, invisible, undetectable to any eye or instrument that existed in the 19th century. Victoria never knew it was there. She felt nothing. She suffered nothing. She lived to 81 years old and ruled the British Empire for 63 of them and was, in every observable way, in robust and formidable health until nearly the end. But she carried it forward. The mutation affected a protein responsible for blood clotting. Carriers, women who held one normal copy and one defective copy of the relevant gene, would never show symptoms. Their blood would clot perfectly well. They would live ordinary lives, never knowing what they carried, never suspecting that the invisible letter in their DNA had been rewritten into something that would, in sons and grandsons and great-grandsons, become catastrophic. Hemophilia B, a condition in which blood, when released from a vessel, keeps going. A bruise becomes a hemorrhage. A small cut becomes a crisis. A fall that an ordinary boy walks away from can, in a hemophiliac boy, cause internal bleeding that does not stop. Victoria's son, Leopold, died at 30 from a brain hemorrhage following a minor fall. Victoria mourned him and moved forward, because queens do not have the option of stopping. Her daughters, Alice and Beatrice, each carried the gene in their cells, silent and faithful, and passed it on to their own daughters, and those daughters carried it to the royal houses of Russia and Germany and Spain, tucked invisibly inside the prestigious bloodlines that everyone was so carefully examining for purity and prestige. No one checked for the broken letter. No one knew to check. Genetics as a science barely existed. The word gene would not be coined until 1909, 3 years after the wedding. So Ina arrived in Madrid, carrying something she did not know she carried, and Alfonso met her without knowing what he was receiving, and the whole vast court apparatus that scrutinized every detail of a royal bride's background, every ancestor, every connection, every loyalty. All of it missed the one thing that mattered. They were married. They were happy. Not the performed happiness of royal portraits, but something more real, more ordinary, more difficult to sustain. The happiness of two young people genuinely trying to build a life together inside an institution that was not designed for genuine happiness. Ina learned Spanish. She learned to navigate the court, to understand which dowager's opinion mattered and which could be safely ignored, to endure the interminable religious ceremonies and state dinners and public appearances with a grace that Alfonso watched with quiet pride. She was not Spanish, but she was trying, and Alfonso valued the trying, almost more than he valued the succeeding. He was not an easy man to love. He was brilliant and restless and incapable of sitting still, physically or politically. He made decisions quickly and changed them quicker. He had the Bourbon temperament. Passionate, impatient, prone to grand gestures and sudden reversals. He needed someone steady beside him, and Ina was steady. She was the still center of his spinning life, and he knew it. And in the privacy of their marriage, he was grateful for it. When she told him she was pregnant, he wept. Not from sadness, but from a feeling he could not quite name, something between relief and terror, and profound, overwhelming love. He was going to be a father. The dynasty he had inherited was going to continue. And something about that felt, for the first time, entirely his own. Their son was born on May 10th, 1907. They named him Alfonso, Prince of Asturias. The court celebrated. Spain celebrated. The newspapers ran photographs of the young king holding his heir, and Alfonso looked at the camera with an expression of pure, uncomplicated joy that was rare in photographs of kings. Then the circumcision wound would not stop bleeding. The doctors worked for hours, hours for a wound that should have closed in minutes. When they finally stanched the bleeding, the room held a silence that no one gave a name to. because naming it would make it real. Alfonso was told his son had a fragility, a delicacy, something that would require careful management. He was not told the full truth yet. Perhaps the doctors hoped they were wrong. Perhaps they needed more time to be certain. Perhaps they simply lacked the courage to tell a king, on the day after the birth of his heir, that the heir's blood would not clot. When the truth came, it came plainly. Hemophilia, inherited through the mother's line. The Prince of Asturias could not be assured normal lifespan. He could not roughhouse, could not fall, could not live with the ordinary physical abandon of boyhood. He had inherited the mutation that had traveled from Victoria of England through Beatrice, through Anna, into this small, newly born life. What Alfonso said to Anna in that moment, "You have given me a son who cannot be king," or words to that effect, for the exact quote is disputed and may be apocryphal, was not the worst thing a husband has ever said to a wife. History has recorded far worse. But it was the thing that changed everything between them, because it located blame in her body, in the invisible letter in her cells that she had not chosen and could not have known about, and would have given anything to undo. She had not known. That is the fact that matters most, and it is the fact that Alfonso, in his grief and his shock and his fear, could not fully hold. She had not known. She was 22 years old in a foreign country, and she had given everything she had, and the result had been a child she loved completely, and a husband who looked at her now with something behind his eyes that had not been there on the morning of the bomb, when he had held her hand in the street and they had survived together. But here is what history records less often, what gets lost in the story of the dynasty's decline. Ina stayed. She did not retreat into self-pity, though she would have had every right to. She did not stop trying to be a mother, a wife, a queen, though all three roles had become significantly harder. She loved her hemophiliac son with the fierce specificity that mothers reserve for children who require more vigilance, more gentleness, more creativity, in finding ways to give a dangerous world to a child who cannot afford to be hurt by it. She taught him chess because chess was safe. She read to him for hours. She taught him languages. He learned 4 before he was 10, because language was something you could go anywhere in without bleeding. When he asked why he could not run the way other boys ran, she told him that some people are built for speed and some are built for depth, and that depth was the rarer gift. She did not know if she believed this. She said it anyway, the way mothers say the things that need to be said, regardless of their certainty. Alfonso watched her do all of this, and somewhere in him, beneath the grief, beneath the withdrawal, beneath the ways he had learned to protect himself from a marriage that had become painful, he saw her clearly. He saw what she was doing. He saw what it cost her. He never quite found the language to tell her that he saw it. But he saw it. Their second son, Jaime, was born deaf and became mute after a botched surgical attempt to treat an ear infection. He would later renounce his place in the succession, saying simply that he could not hear the country he was meant to serve. There was no self-pity in the statement. There was only a kind of terrible clarity. A third son, Fernando, lived barely 2 months. And then, in the middle of all this grief in 1913, a fourth son was born, Juan, and Juan was healthy. His blood clotted. He fell and rose and was bruised and healed and ran the way boys are meant to run, and Ina held him and wept for an entirely different reason than she had wept before. Not every son carried the broken letter. Not every child was the gene. Juan was the proof of that. Ordinary, robust, boisterous proof that the mutation was not a sentence applied to every life she would bring into the world. He would grow into adulthood, and through him, the line would travel forward intact. The dynasty's survival ran through Juan. It had always run through Juan, even in the years when no throne existed to inherit. A fifth son, Gonzalo, was confirmed hemophiliac at birth. Another prince whose blood would not stop. 6 pregnancies, 2 hemophiliac sons, 1 deaf-mute son, 1 healthy son, one infant dead, and, through all of it, Ina doing what she had always done, staying, learning, loving, managing the unmanageable with a steadiness that the court, which had never fully accepted her, now could not help but respect, even in whispers. The young Prince Alfonso grew into a serious, gentle boy. He understood early that his body was a negotiation, not a given. He understood that the extraordinary privilege of being heir to the Spanish throne had an extraordinary price. He was required to live more carefully than any king before him, to treat his own existence as something precious and provisional, to move through the world with a deliberateness that looked, from the outside, like gravity, and was from the inside, a constant low-level management of fear. He was not bitter. That is the remarkable thing. He had every reason to be bitter. Born into the highest position in Spain, and then told, quietly but unmistakably, that the position might kill him. And instead, he became something rarer. He became thoughtful. He read everything. He asked questions that made his tutors uncomfortable, the kind of questions children ask when they have spent too much time thinking about mortality. What does it mean for a country to survive its king? What does a dynasty owe the people who believe in it? Is it possible to love something you were given no choice about? He asked his mother these questions because she was the person he trusted most in a court full of people performing loyalty. Ina answered carefully, honestly, the way she had always spoken to him. She told him that love which has no choice in it is often the deepest kind. She told him that Spain was worth whatever it asked of him. She told him that a king who understood fragility was better prepared for kingship than one who had never known it. He listened. He nodded. He was 13 years old, and he listened the way very old people sometimes listen, as though he was collecting something to keep. Outside the palace walls, Spain was fracturing. There had always been fault lines between monarchists and republicans, between the powerful church and the secular left, between the landed aristocracy and the desperately poor, between Madrid and the regions that had never entirely forgiven Madrid for existing. Alfonso XIII navigated these fault lines with energy and erratic intelligence, sometimes brilliantly, sometimes catastrophically, always moving, never stopping long enough to let any single disaster fully attach itself to him. But political gravity does not care for speed. The disasters accumulated. What saved the story from being only a tragedy was the love that ran through it sideways, in directions that were not the obvious ones. Ina and her eldest son, Alfonso, an intimacy so complete that the court could see it from across a room. He was the one who had made her a mother, who had cost her the marriage she'd hoped for, and who had somehow, in the years between, become the closest thing she had, a true companion in Spain. They spoke in English when they were alone, her first language, the language of her grandmother's long wind-swept island, and in that language she could be fully herself, not Queen Victoria Eugenie, not the foreign wife of Alfonso XIII, not the carrier of the gene that had complicated everything, but Ina, simply Ina, talking to her son. She told him once in one of those English conversations that no court recorder preserved, that she was sorry. Not the political apology, not the formal royal statement, the real one, the mother's one. Sorry that his life was shaped by something she had not chosen and could not change. Sorry for the careful way he had to live. Sorry that his body, which she had made and loved and spent years learning how to protect, was also the thing most likely to hurt him. He told her, he was 17 when this conversation happened, old enough to mean it, that she did not need to apologize for what she had not chosen. That her care was not a compensation for the gene. It was its own thing, separate and complete. That he had grown up knowing himself to be profoundly loved, and that this was not a small thing. This was, in fact, the largest thing. She wept. He was embarrassed in the way 17-year-olds are embarrassed by their mother's tears, and then he put his arm around her in the way that children eventually do, and they sat together in the private library of the palace, while Madrid moved outside the windows, and whatever complex accounting exists between mothers and children and the terrible inheritance of love. They had settled it between them. He renounced his claim to the succession in 1933 to marry a Cuban commoner. His father was furious. The court was scandalized. The newspapers wrote about the abdication of duty, the failure of royal responsibility, the insult to Spain. What no newspaper wrote was this: he was 26 years old, and he had found someone who loved him for what he was, not for what he represented, and he had chosen ordinary life over the throne, with the same quiet decisiveness that his mother had brought to every impossible situation she had ever faced. He had learned it from her. That choosing, the willingness to release what is expected and hold instead what is true. He had learned from watching her do it year after year in a marriage and a country that did not always deserve her. He moved to Miami. He built a modest life. He was, by the accounts of those who knew him there, happy. Genuinely, simply, ordinarily happy, in a way that the palace had never quite permitted. In 1938, he was in a minor car accident. The wound would not close. He died at 31 from internal bleeding, just 1 year older than his great-great-uncle Leopold had been. The same cause, the same broken letter in the genome, replicated faithfully across 4 generations, arriving, finally here, in a hospital in Miami, far from Madrid, far from the palace and the court and the bomb-torn street on his parents' wedding day. He was buried quietly. His mother, in exile by then, Alfonso XIII, had left Spain in 1931 when the Republic was declared, and the family had scattered across Europe, received the news in Lausanne. She sat alone with it for a long time. Then she wrote him a letter she could not send, the way mothers write letters to children who have died, as though the act of writing is its own form of refusing to accept that the conversation is over. No one knows what she wrote. She burned it afterward. Gonzalo died in 1934. He was 19, killed by internal bleeding after a car accident in Austria. The second hemophiliac son, gone 6 years after the family had already lost nearly everything else, Alfonso XIII, died in Rome in 1941, in a hotel room, in exile, surrounded by the dwindling court in exile that had followed him from Spain. He had spent 10 years watching the dynasty dissolve and the sons die and the country he'd been born. To rule becomes something he no longer recognized. He had not been a perfect king or a perfect husband or a perfect father. He had made errors that historians have spent decades cataloging. He had caused real damage to real people with real decisions. But in those last years, stripped of the palace and the position and the performance, he had become, in the accounts of those who were with him, something simpler. A man who missed his wife, a man who thought about his sons, a man who held his own complicity in his hands and turned it over slowly, in the way that aging people examine the things they cannot undo, trying to understand the weight of them. He wrote to Ina near the end. The letter was not political, not royal, not formal. It was a husband's letter, imperfect and belated, the kind of letter that arrives too late to repair what it addresses, but that matters anyway, because writing it was an act of honesty that cost something. She kept it. She never spoke publicly about what was in it. Ina outlived them all. Alfonso died in 1941. Her hemophiliac sons died in the 30s. The Spain she had known ceased to exist and became something unrecognizable under Franco. She lived in exile in Lausanne, for decades, an old woman in a foreign city, tending the memory of a life that had been shaped by a single invisible mutation she had never chosen and could never have known about. She was asked, near the end of her life, whether she regretted marrying Alfonso. She paused for a long time before answering, long enough that the interviewer began to fill the silence. She stopped him. She said, "I loved Spain. I never stopped loving Spain." It was not the answer to the question that had been asked. It was a better answer. It was the answer that told the true story, that what she had loved was not diminished by what it had cost her, that the mutation and the grief and the years of careful public performance over private devastation had not cured her of the thing she felt for the country she had chosen by choosing its king. That love, when it is real and not merely performed, survives even the catastrophes it cannot prevent. She returned to Spain exactly once, in 1968, 62 years after the wedding, to attend the christening of her great-grandson. She stood in the cathedral, 81 years old, and watched the ceremony with those eyes that were still, witnesses agreed, entirely clear. She had not been invited back before this. She was not asked to stay. She flew back to Lausanne the following day. She died the following year, 1969, in the country that had sheltered her decades of exile. On her bedside table, they found a photograph from the wedding day of 1906. Not the formal portrait, the photograph taken in the street after the bomb, before anyone had cleaned anything or restored any order, when the smoke was still in the air and the carnage was still visible, and Alfonso was holding her hand in the ruins of what was supposed to be only joyful. Both of them looking at the camera. Both of them unhurt. Both of them so impossibly young that it is almost unbearable to look at, knowing what is coming. She had kept it for 63 years. The worst photograph from the best day, or the best photograph from the worst day, depending perhaps on how you measure days, on whether you count survival as a kind of victory regardless of what comes after. Here is what a gene cannot know. It cannot know what it travels through. It cannot know the names of the people who carry it, or the countries they will carry it to, or the dynasties it will complicate as it replicates faithfully forward through generations. It has no plan. It has no malice. It is simply a letter and a text, 3 billion letters long, copied incorrectly once, copied correctly every time thereafter, passing from mother to child to grandchild to great-grandchild with the mindless precision of biological inheritance. It passed through Queen Victoria, who knew nothing of it, who ruled her empire and mourned her son, and sent her daughters into the royal houses of Europe, without knowing she was also sending this invisible passenger along. It passed through Beatrice, who knew nothing of it, who was careful and devoted, and never once suspected that her own body contained something that would complicate her daughter's life and her daughter's sons' lives. It passed through Ina, who knew nothing of it, who crossed from England to Spain and converted her faith and learned a new language and loved a difficult man and raised damaged and brilliant children with a steadiness that was not easy and was not natural and was in the end entirely chosen. And here is the thing about chosen steadiness. It is stronger than inherited fragility. Not because love is always stronger than loss. It is not. Anyone who has lived long enough knows it is not. But because love is more willing to keep trying. Because love will stay in a room where loss will leave. Because love will find the language for the next conversation, even when the last one ended badly. Will find the photograph worth keeping, even when the day it captures was also terrible. Will find the letter worth writing, even when it arrives too late. Ina's children and grandchildren carried the dynasty forward. Not the dynasty of pure blood and Nuremberg laws and genealogical tables. That dynasty, the one Alfonso XIII had been trying to preserve, was gone. But the actual dynasty, the human one, the one made not of claims and documents, but of love handed down through generations, of steadiness modeled and learned and practiced, of the choice made again and again by Ina, then by her children, then by her grandchildren. To stay when leaving would have been easier. In 1975, Spain returned to democracy, and the monarchy returned with it. Juan Carlos I, son of Infante Juan, grandson of Alfonso and Ena, became king. Not a king of empire and absolute power, but a constitutional king, a guardian of a democratic state, a man who in 1981 went on national television and ordered a military coup to stand down in a speech so plain and so unafraid that the soldiers obeyed. The line had passed through Juan, the healthy son, the one the gene had missed, and had arrived here, in a king steady enough to save the country his grandfather had lost. He had his grandmother's steadiness. You could see it in the way he held the camera when he spoke. Still, certain. Not performing certainty, but possessing it, which is a different thing entirely. The hemophilia gene did not pass through that line. Modern medicine made it irrelevant in any case. The broken letter was still there, presumably, somewhere in the long chain of inheritance, or it had been lost in the shuffling of genes across generations. It no longer mattered. What mattered was what had been handed down alongside it, or perhaps in spite of it. The thing Ina had modeled in years of difficult staying. The thing her sons had learned, watching her answer impossible questions with honesty instead of performance. The thing that looks, from the outside, like composure and is from the inside a decision made fresh every morning to show up for what you love, even when showing up costs something. That was the inheritance that survived, not the gene. Not the dynasty in its formal, ceremonial, genealogically certified form, not the palace or the power or the carefully recorded bloodlines going back 7 centuries. The love, the practiced, costly, chosen love, the kind that finds a photograph worth keeping from a terrible day, the kind that writes a letter even when it arrives too late, the kind that answers "I loved Spain" when asked whether it was worth it, because the person asking is looking for an accounting, and you know that love does not submit to accountings. That is the inheritance that traveled forward. One woman who stayed when leaving would have been easier, who loved what she had, chosen even when it cost her almost everything she had, who taught her children that depth is the rarer gift and that love that has no choice in it is often the deepest kind, and who was right about both things. Her great-grandson stood before cameras and saved a democracy with the same steadiness she had carried through decades of exile. He had come through Juan, the son the gene had spared, and that line of survival, biological and moral together, was hers. Her blood ran in his veins. So did the gene, perhaps, but also this, also the other thing, also the steadiness and the choosing and the willingness to hold something broken and love it anyway. Also that, the bomb missed. The gene could not destroy what love had already decided to protect. There is a photograph in the Spanish Royal Archives, taken sometime in the early 1950s, when Ina was living in Lausanne. She is in a garden, a small, private, unroyal garden, with ordinary flowers and iron chairs. And she's reading a letter. The photograph was taken without her knowledge, by someone who later said they had never been able to explain why they raised the camera in that moment. Something in her posture, perhaps. Something in the quality of stillness. She is reading, and her face is entirely unguarded. None of the composure of the official portraits, none of the careful performance of the public queen. She looks in this photograph like what she was. A woman in her 60s who had loved and lost and stayed and continued, who had outlived her marriage and several of her children and the country she had chosen and nearly everything she had been given at the beginning. She does not look broken. She looks like someone who has decided, again this morning as on every morning, to be here, to read the letter, to sit in the garden, to continue. That is not a small thing. That is, in fact, everything. The dynasties that survive are not the ones that never break. Every dynasty breaks eventually. Every bloodline runs eventually into something it cannot control. A mutation, a war, a revolution, a single wrong letter in 3 billion. The ones that survive are the ones that know what to carry forward when everything else has been stripped away. The ones that understand the difference between the throne, which is a piece of furniture, and the inheritance, which is a way of being in the world. Aina knew the difference. She always had. That was the dynasty. That was what lasted. And in the end, In the very long, very complicated, very human end, the love was what lasted.